My engine turned off. I'm at 1,600. I'm going to be landing. I don't know where.
My name is Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. I want to go ahead and jump right in and try to cover these because, like I said, we've got 5 different tragedies to talk about. And I did a little bit of research trying to find good examples of things that I think are common hazards that we see in aviation, some of the items that run in a lot of the videos that I make. But I also wanted to not necessarily share with you aviation tragedies that I've already covered. So I'll talk about where I got some of these from a little bit later on, but I want to go ahead and get started with the first one right here. Anti-authority. So this is the hazardous attitude. It's really a dangerous attitude that you see in pilots that, they have this attitude where they don't want to be told what to do necessarily. These are the folks that feel like rules and regulations don't necessarily apply to them. They don't like to follow checklists, things like that. And one of the things that you're going to see as a common trend with all of these mishaps and tragedies that we're going to talk about is complacency is also going to play a role in all of this as well. This is a Dassault Falcon 900EX, November 823 Romeo Charlie, and this happened on 13 February 2021. It was out at Montgomery Gibbs Executive Airport. And on this one, you can see you've got runway 28 right. I kind of highlighted it, and you've got the green arrow. He's taken off on 28 right there. So it's a fairly short runway. But what happened is at rotation speed, the captain pulled back and the nose did not rotate. So he relaxed that back stick pressure and then tried again a few seconds later and then still didn't get airborne. And so they tried to abort the takeoff and, thrust reversers, everything, full abort procedures. Ended up going off the end of the runway down there at the end. This is actually the only tragedy that I'm going to talk about today where the pilot actually managed to live, but I wanted to share it because it was just such an atrocious example of anti-authority. So what happened is they attempted to take off. They were almost 3,000 pounds over their max gross weight at the takeoff. They had the wrong stabilizer trim setting, so they weren't using the checklist really and checking that stuff. The runway ended up being almost 600 feet shorter than what was required for takeoff at the aircraft's gross weight when they began that takeoff roll. And he started his rotation about 23 knots slower than what the calculated rotation speed is. And what they discovered, a lot of words on the screen here, but what it boils down to is when the investigation started digging into the details, they looked at, you've got the captain and the first officer, and they're putting all these numbers into the FMS, the flight management system that's going to calculate, everything that they need for their performance. And if they had actually put in all the numbers correctly, they would have gotten an error warning saying field limited, basically telling them, hey, you don't have a long enough runway here to take off. And they also wouldn't have generated airspeed numbers. So they wouldn't have seen what their rotation speed is and that stuff. So the only way they were actually able to not get that message, and that the only way they were able to actually conduct this takeoff and have, some speeds that they could reference is they either had to input the wrong runway length or they had to input inaccurate weights for the fuel and the passengers and the cargo. So they weren't really able to determine what they did, but it was fairly obvious that they did it intentionally and it wasn't just some sort of haphazard, inputting the wrong numbers into the system. The shocking part of this to me, when I started looking at this, I wanted to almost make like a full video about this incident. And I realized this was just something that was more important to wrap into today's video because the pilot, he's got 8,800 flight hours. So plenty of experience doing this takeoff. He said he used his tablet and the performance software on there to also calculate the weight and balance and the takeoff data. But when the investigators asked him to see the tablet, he told them, well, it was destroyed. Well, you could obviously see from the photo where they went off the end of the runway, the airplane didn't catch on fire. They were all able to safely egress and no issues there. So basically he's not giving them what they need. So now is where they start doing a little bit more digging to find out what's really going on with this guy and what the story is. They ended up finding out he never held a type rating for the accident airplane. So this individual's been working for someone, flying this aircraft around, flying passengers without a valid type rating for the plane that he was flying. He actually started training in that aircraft, but he never completed the training. So at some point, I don't think he was kicked out, but he just left the training and just never finished it. And then the most shocking thing was the FAA had issued an emergency revocation of all his certificates 2 years earlier. So this is where the FAA is going to come in, and they've identified something that's just so egregious that they need to go ahead and pull all your certificates, meaning like you shouldn't be flying anymore anywhere else. And I don't know how you get it back, but because I've never ran into anybody that actually had to deal with that issue. But the reason why they revoked all his certificates was that a couple years back, when he was employed as a check pilot for a Part 135 operator, which is a charter company, he falsified logbook entries and records for proficiency checks, competency checks, and training events on 15 separate occasions. If you guys want to see another example of a pilot exhibiting an anti-authority attitude, I've made this video about 5 months ago. This guy's flying around and buzzes into some airspace and lies to the controller about it. But I thought this first one was just a really good example, and it's just shocking how, I don't know what gets into a pilot's frame of mind where they decide that, first of all, I'm falsifying stuff, I'm lying about records, things like that. And the FAA has stepped in and said, you know what, we're pulling all your certificates. But yet for some reason, he goes on to continue flying for 2 more years before it finally catches up with him with his mishap. And, honestly, like the passengers on that aircraft were probably very fortunate, because that's the type of attitude, that anti-authority attitude where, I'm not going to use the checklist. I'm going to do whatever I want. I don't care whether I'm being disciplined or not. Like, they feel like they have this inherent right to just keep flying. It's extremely dangerous. It's something that you have to watch out for. If you're ever flying with a pilot like that, that's starting to demonstrate that, you just got to cut that off, or be willing to walk away from those types of situations. And the fix in general for this is follow the rules, because the rules are going to be right. As soon as you start to deviate from the rules, you do it one time, then you start to normalize that deviancy. And then over time, it just becomes easier and easier. And I think for this guy with over 8,000 hours, he just got to a point where, well, I'm not going to get caught. It's not a big deal. I'm just going to keep flying. And that's not going to be an issue. So that's one I think that's, it's definitely something that can be very dangerous. And you're going to see anti-authority also pop up in some of these other examples as well as we walk through these. The next one I wanted to talk about was impulsivity. But before I talk about that, one of the things that I think is important to address is the pilot debrief itself. So when fighter pilots go to do a debrief, the whole point of that debrief is we have certain mission objectives that we're going to evaluate, and we're going to take a look at the truth data to compare that against the mission objectives to figure out what learning points we can develop out of that. And so we have what we call a debrief focus point that we can focus the debrief on. And we want to get into the why about what happened. And that's kind of the human factors part of the mishap. And it's never about trying to blame or accuse and put somebody down. We want to identify those errors. We want to identify the mistakes, so that way we can all learn from that and improve. And I think one of the best things about, the fighter pilot debrief, having been a fighter pilot and sat in many of those debriefs, is the fact that, you can walk in and you can have, 100 hours and be brand new in the aircraft, and you can be flying with somebody that's got 3,000 hours. And there's just this level of understanding within the debrief that, the rank comes off, and you're able to sit there and have open and honest conversations about what went wrong and why it went wrong. And I think when it comes to the general aviation flying community, that's something that sometimes gets lost, in the training portion and the execution. And then obviously, like once you get your license and you go flying, if you're just flying, for yourself as a Part 91 flyer, it's very important to still take the time to debrief yourself on what went wrong and things that you can do to improve going forward. One of the things that you might want to consider is, the more hours that you get in that aircraft, the more prone you're going to be, I think, to becoming complacent with your flying and complacent with your training and things like that. And so thinking about some of these, attitudes, you're going to see how it's easy to, fall into one of these traps if you're not keeping yourself honest during the process there. So impulsivity, this one was kind of interesting. This is a experimental helicopter, a rotorway jet exec, November 162 November Hotel. This is on 3 September 2022. The pilot has 40,000 hours of flight time, which is absolutely ridiculous. There's a ton of flight time, ton of experience flying aircraft, and definitely knows all the rules, or should by this point, easily. What happened here is there was an individual who had purchased a helicopter, and he had asked for the pilot to fly it down to Knoxville for him and deliver the helicopter to him. When he went to do one of those flights, because it was I think it was supposed to be like 3 flights to make the trip. I think it was on the second flight. Several witnesses said that they were aware of stormy weather in the area, and they tried to convince the pilot to wait a day or two for the weather to improve. And the impulsivity attitude is this attitude where you're trying to do something quickly, you're rushing to get things done. And so we see this a lot of times with pilots where, hey, maybe there's some weather coming in, or I got to get home. It's the get home-itis type of attitude, when that happens, or when this happened, they tried to warn him about the weather. He didn't even go get a pre-flight weather briefing to check the weather. So, it's not known if he checked it on his iPad or did something else to determine the weather, but he didn't get an official pre-flight weather briefing prior to conducting the flight. When he took off, he didn't wait, and he took off with his wife initially. So the two of them took off. About 30 minutes later, he came back to the airport. And my guess is probably because he got airborne and he realized, this weather is probably not the best. I'm going to come back. But he decides, no, I'm just going to drop off my wife, and then I'm going to go ahead and make this trip myself. His wife ended up actually hopping on a private jet and flying herself wherever they were going. So she ended up making it safely. This guy he takes off. And you can see from the investigation, the radar image here of the where the accident site was. This is just not the type of weather you want to be flying around in, and any type of aircraft. And I'm not sure, with a cell this big, why a pilot would assume that it's possible for them to make it, And so I think there's a lot of attitudes at play in this tragedy. But the impulsivity, I got to rush to get there. It doesn't matter what the weather's, saying, or it doesn't matter what I'm seeing. I'm going to make this flight happen, and I'm going to get it done. Maybe because it's, if he gets it done, he can go ahead and get home sooner and take care of things, or whatever he's got going on the other end of that. Probable cause was he likely encountered reduced visibility and heavy rain while in the thunderstorm, which is pretty typical. But had he actually obtained a weather briefing, he might have elected to delay the flight until the conditions improved. And then ultimately his decision to attempt the flight into thunderstorm conditions resulted into controlled flight into terrain. So not a good one. We see this, like I said, a lot of times with pilots that are trying to get somewhere in a hurry. And the solution for this is, you got to remember, just slow down, take your time, not so fast, and think first before you go do something. Because you can see even a guy with 40,000 hours, you got to make these smart decisions. All right. Next one I want to talk about is invulnerability. So these are the pilots that I think you see this a lot of times with younger pilots. especially that don't have a lot of experience in the aircraft. Brent, somebody that's been a student pilot and they just now got their pilot license, especially in their young 20s, they almost feel invulnerable, like nothing's going to happen to them. They're going to be able to make it work, and things are going to be okay. And they also have this attitude that, accidents tend to happen to other pilots. An accident's never going to happen to me because I do everything right, and that's just the way things are. This is a Rockwell Commander 114, Victor Hotel Whiskey Mike, 19 December 2021. And this is a picture of the aircraft after it was kind of recovered or recovered essentially, because this was the actual crash when it overturned in the water after it crashed on takeoff. With this one, you're going to see there's a little bit of checklist complacency with this, but in my opinion, this is not an anti-authority. I don't feel like the guy was actually intentionally like always disregarding the checklist, because the aircraft had been in the hangar. The fuel had moved probably over to one of the wings, and he should have known about the imbalance by measuring the fuel before the flight, and he didn't do that. And then it was likely that the fuel tank selection prior to takeoff was on the left fuel tank only. So when he was doing his run-ups on the ground, one of the things that happened was there was something wrong with the aircraft, and it caused a distraction. And whenever you have a distraction, that's the point where, it's very easy for you to completely focus on the distraction and disregard everything else that you're doing. And it's so important to, when that distraction happens, you've got to like pause. Once you're done dealing with that distraction, come back to what you're doing and finish it. And if you don't, it's very easy to overlook things. And so that's why, even though the investigation report talked a lot about his checklist usage and how certain items in the checklist were skipped over, I don't think it was, like I said, this anti-authority attitude where he was just intentionally skipping over things. He just got distracted, like many of us do. And I think that happens a lot of times where once you have so many flights conducted safely and you're flying out of the same airfield and you've been flying the aircraft for a while, you get to a point where you feel very comfortable in that aircraft. And it's very easy to assume, well, I've never had an emergency, in the last 2 years, I've never had anything wrong with my aircraft. So nothing's going to happen to me, and I'm not going to worry. You don't think about these things as much when you go to do your flight. So ultimately, when he started taxiing again, he never continued or restarted the pre-takeoff checklist. He also didn't brief the passengers an emergency briefing on what to do in case they ended up ditching, because the runway they're taking off from, you'll see here in a second, is right on the water. And right after that, he gets airborne. I'm not sure if he started this turn to the left right on takeoff as pre-planned, or if he started that turn because the engine was running rough and then he lost power in the middle of that turn. And so as he's making this turn, the engine stops about 3/4 of the way through the turn. He ends up lowering the gear, and that's going to be a contributing factor to ultimately why they die. He makes a distress call and then almost makes it back to the shoreline as he's trying to make it back to the runway. He didn't maintain the proper glide speed, and they impacted the shallow water. And then because he had lowered that landing gear, what happened is, as they impacted the water, that contributed to the aircraft overturning. And in that limited amount of time from when they lost power in flight till they hit the water, he never talked to the passengers about what to do as soon as they hit the water, how to get out of the aircraft and that sort of thing. And I don't have the image in the slide deck here, but another one of the contributing factors is it was the pilot, 2 children, and another adult. And the pilot's sitting in the front left seat, and he put a child in the front right seat. So you've got your 2 emergency exit doors up there. And so the child was not aware or able, necessarily to open that emergency exit door on the right-hand side. So that was also a contributing factor. And I think, again, it's this accidents happen to other pilots. They don't happen to me. I'm not going to put the kids in the back. I'm going to let one of the kids sit up front, and then, nothing's going to happen, because nothing ever happens on these flights. So it's just a very tragic situation because all 4 of them ended up dying. And the obvious fix to this is anytime you're doing a flight, you've got to realize, mistakes can happen. It doesn't matter what your experience level is, or whether you've had 100 flights safely conducted, in the last year or whenever. Things can go wrong. And so it could happen to me. You want to treat every flight with the same level of respect that it deserves for the profession that we're in, whether you're doing this as a hobby or as an actual job. The next one I want to talk about here is macho. This one was a tough one. So this is all that was left of the aircraft as it impacted, right along the shoreline. This is not the accident aircraft, but I just wanted to show you what the aircraft looked like. A Piper PA-46 Malibu Meridian, November 234 Papa Mike, 9 November 2022. And then a couple of definitions here, just to give you a little bit better context. So VFR is, you're flying. These are pilots, brand new pilots that don't have an instrument rating. And obviously, if you have an instrument rating, you can fly VFR too. But VFR essentially means the weather's greater than 3,000 feet and you have greater than 5 miles visibility. Then you have what's called marginal VFR, and that's where the ceilings are between 1,000 and 3,000 feet and 3 to 5 miles visibility. And then you have IFR, instrument flight rules, where the weather's a little bit worse. And then I think it's low IFR or limited IFR, but low IFR, less than 500 feet and less than a mile. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate the support there. When it came to this mishap with the Macho Authority, we see this where pilots have this attitude of, I can do it. And you're trying to either impress yourself or impress other people. In my mind, the Macho Authority, I think it also ties into the invulnerability. The macho hazardous attitude ties into the invulnerability attitude, where you're kind of, just of this mindset that, I'm going to make it work. And it doesn't matter my experience level, that sort of thing. In this situation, the pilot actually did get a weather briefing 2.5 hours before the flight. He did have an instrument rating, and the destination weather was reporting marginal VFR conditions. The TAF, which is the terminal area forecast, that was amended twice between the time of his briefing and the time of his accident, to indicate IFR to low IFR conditions. So the conditions were essentially worsening. And as he's on this flight, the destination ASOS, that's the weather reporting for the area, was reporting overcast ceilings at 300 feet. The pilot had purchased this aircraft 3 weeks before the accident. And this happens, I think, it's happened in several other mishaps where I've talked about, somebody goes out and they buy a new aircraft and they don't have enough experience in that aircraft to fully understand what's going on. But his instructor, when he did that training, and thanks, Mike, I appreciate the support there. Another super chat coming in. The instructor gave him a low average score at the completion of his training. So he didn't say he was a terrible pilot or anything, but for somebody that didn't have a lot of time, he was, low to average essentially throughout his training process. He only had about 500 flight hours, but he only had 24 and a half hours in the accident aircraft. Only 5.2 of those hours were actual instrument flight time in that accident airplane. And, he only had 5.2 hours of actual instrument flight time. And he only had 1 hour of instrument time in the accident aircraft itself. And that 1 hour of flight time was flying IFR at high altitude. So not necessarily trying to shoot an instrument approach, not trying to do a challenging descent through the weather by yourself, but you're flying up at high altitude, straight and level, and you happen to run us into some clouds, and you've probably got the autopilot on. And so it's not necessarily a challenging situation that you have to deal with. So in this type of, scenario, I think there's, the macho-ness is that overconfidence that, I've just got my license. I've got some hours. I've got some training. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and buy a new aircraft and I'm signed off and it's good to go. So the pilot, he had awareness of what the weather was like at the field with, at least with that marginal VFR forecast that he had. And then, the forecast had been updated throughout the time of between his briefing and the accident. So he could have checked the weather en route to see what was going on, but also you can just look outside. You can talk to the approach controller. There's a lot of tools that you can use, and including getting the weather observation from the field itself to figure out what's going on to make that assessment. And somebody with 500 hours should have enough knowledge to do that. But I think there was just this, a lot of overconfidence here in this situation. Now, another pilot that was following him shooting this instrument approach said that the weather at the time he started flying the approach was reported as a ceiling near 200 feet with visibility 1 to 2 miles. The cloud tops were at 7,500, and it was a turbulent approach with potential icing and a tailwind landing. And he called the approach essentially a very demanding approach. The probable cause ended up being the pilot's flight into low instrument flight rules, conditions, and turbulence, which resulted in spatial disorientation, loss of control, and an impact with the terrain. And contributing to the accident was the pilot's lack of total instrument experience. That's a good. So the question is from Krishna: how long did he have his instrument rating? And I'd have to go back and look, but I'm not entirely sure. I do know from what I pulled from the investigation, and the summary was that he only had 5 hours of actual instrument flight time and only 1 hour of instrument time in the accident aircraft itself. So that is not a lot of instrument experience. And I covered another mishap not too long ago on my channel where a pilot, sort of a similar situation, but this guy, he actually had I think hundreds of hours flying with instructors, and he had an instrument rating, and he goes to fly this approach into San Antonio, and he ended up shooting the approach. I think it was 3 times. And each time he's trying this approach, he's not able to figure out how to either turn on the auto or how to connect the autopilot, how to get it to couple with the approach to actually fly the approach, or he's not understanding how to navigate the aircraft. And it was very challenging weather conditions. And for him, I think the ceilings were only about 500 feet. So not as bad as in this scenario, but the guy didn't have, even though he had that instrument rating, he didn't have a lot of experience flying in those types of conditions. And that's one caution I would give. If you're a newly instrument rated pilot, you've just got your instrument rating, take as much opportunity as you can to practice instrument flying, even after you get your rating, before you put yourself in a very demanding situation like this, where the weather forecast is maybe marginal VFR, and you're like, okay, that'd be a good opportunity for me to practice. Well, if that's the case, then, when you're en route to that destination, get an update on the weather, figure out what's going on, and make that determination. Is it really worth it for me to go ahead and try to shoot this approach when I know I've got clouds, from 7,000 feet all the way down almost to the surface? I've got a tailwind. It's going to be a turbulent approach, and I'm by myself. I've got nobody else to back me up, and I've never done this before. That's just not a good idea. That's, something that I really appreciated flying the Strike Eagle, was having a crewmate sitting behind me, my Wizzo, that I could talk to and ask him, hey, back me up on this approach. Here's what I'm seeing. And this, here's what I'm seeing next. And here's my next altitude. Does this look right to you? And we talk about the approach. And that's why airline pilots do these approach briefings. And you've got, your captain, your first officer, and the two of them can talk about everything that's going to happen on the approach, the threats to the approach, and things like that. And, it's because we can back each other up. I don't know how comfortable I would feel as a low time, back when I first started flying, low time instrument rated guy trying to fly a very challenging approach in the weather. And so that is the macho attitude that can very easily get yourself killed if you're not careful and watching out for it. Sean, thank you so much for the super chat there. I appreciate that. Dane, thank you as well. And Kim, thank you as well for your super chat there. So, and also, I wanted to take just a second to say thank you to all my channel members and everyone over on Patreon that has done. I don't know. It's so humbling to see the support that I have from the audience, from all my members out there that help make all this content possible. So I greatly appreciate that. And I also want to make a shout out. If you guys haven't noticed, I've got somebody moderating the chat and really helping me out this time. And that is Sticks, is his call sign. He's in the background there. So he won't be up on stage with you guys. But a Hilo guy, we won't hold that against him. And but I got introduced to Sticks because he works with a couple other guys. They have a podcast. It's called So There I Was, and I was actually on their podcast not too long ago. Let me see if I can share this with you guys, because I think you guys might appreciate this. Let's see here. I can see now I got to man the controls and figure out what's going on here. So this is always fun for me. All right. See, this is why I have Sticks in the background to figure it out. There you go. He put it up there. So it's sothereiwas.us is their website. Be sure to check it out. If you guys want to see a podcast where I was in, kind of delve a little bit more into my background and everything, my history, and I share a couple of interesting stories there, including my call sign story, how I got the call sign Hoover. If you missed that on the last live stream that I did, it's on their podcast as well. And you guys can check that out over there. All right. So anyways, again, just greatly appreciate all the support from everybody that's been with me, over the last year or so as we've been doing this channel and kind of growing into this. So, all right, hopping back into this, yep. Okay. All right, catching up. All right, so this is the one that I know a lot of people wanted me to talk about, and it happened recently. One of the things that, if you've been with this channel a while, that I do is I try not to cover recent aviation mishaps. And one of the reasons why is that I think it's so easy to get into speculative territory where you start making guesses about what happened without fully understanding everything that took place within that mishap, because you don't have all the facts. And a lot of times the facts that you're getting, whether it's from the news or social media, they can tend to be inaccurate to a certain degree. And I don't ever want to be the guy that creates a video where I start blaming somebody or start saying, this is the reason why it happened, when that's not necessarily the case, but I also understand that there's a large demand for us to try to figure out what lessons we can draw out of these mishaps while they're still fresh. Because the challenge is, when it comes to the NTSB and the investigations that they do, especially when it's a fatal mishap like this one, you're looking at, a minimum of 1 year, usually 2 years, before you're going to get the full NTSB report about everything that happened with that mishap. And by the time that report comes out, everybody's forgotten about that tragedy. It's no longer fresh in your mind. And I think a lot of those lessons get lost. And so that's why I'm trying to find the right way to start incorporating this back into some of my videos, and hopefully through the live streams, I think there'll be a good way to do that. So this is a Piper PA-32 Turbo Lance, Canadian aircraft, Canadian registration, Foxtrot Bravo Whiskey Hotel. And this happened on the 4th of March. This is the family. that was in the crash. Pilot, father, husband, flying his wife and 3 kids. My understanding is they were trying to make a trip. Make a trip down to Florida. This is why I record these videos sometimes ahead of time. The first flight he did was only 1 hour long, and then after landing, he added 22 gallons of fuel. 90 minutes later, started his second flight. On that second flight was 2.5 hours long. We know that after landing, he added 52 gallons of fuel, and then 40 minutes later, he began his third flight. On that third flight, it was 1.5 hours from the time he took off to about the time he crashed. Sorry. I pulled this from Flystow. So if you guys aren't familiar with Flystow, I'd highly recommend you check them out. They're not a sponsor. They didn't ask me to make a plug for them. But I do think it's a very valuable tool that you can use if you're a pilot, or if you want to just figure out what happened with something. You can go out there and get the ADS-B data. You can upload it to Flystow, and it gives you all these different views about what happened, during the flight and stuff. And you can also use it for all sorts of different evaluations and debriefs and stuff. And Iconic Flight, thank you so much. I really hope everybody stays out of my videos. That's my goal. If whatever we can do to keep people safe, I really want to do what I can for that. So I pulled, this is a screenshot from Flystow. The aircraft that I have in the image, what I have in the image here from the flight, this is when he was 6 miles from the runway. Is where this arrow is up here. He was at about 2,900 feet, and you can see the runway. I've identified it there with the red arrow on the screen. The airport was using runway 20 for landing, and we know that from what was reported from other pilots. And we know that according to the NTSB, the winds were 150 at 8 knots, so fairly light winds. But I want to talk about instrument versus visual approach, because the one thing I don't know is I think, and this is, I'm not speculating, but knowing what I've seen out there on this mishap, was the guy was a fairly low time pilot. My understanding is that he did not have an instrument rating, or if he did have an instrument rating, he was not shooting an instrument approach. The weather was suitable for a visual approach. But the challenging part of this is he's flying into John C-Tune at night. And I say it's challenging. I want to go ahead and show you this. This is a screenshot from Julian Gomez's channel. So this was John C-Tune at night. Now this video was taken 14 years ago, and I can't share the video with you because of copyright stuff on YouTube. But I wanted to show you this picture just so you can see what this airport looks like flying into runway 20 at night, which is the conditions this guy's flying in. If you can't see where the runway is, there's the PAPI lights for runway 20 off in the distance. And I think from this screenshot right here is probably like on a short 2 or 3 mile final. So, and I'll show you a little bit more about the approach here in a second. This is what the runway looks like, runway 20, as he's getting pretty close to landing on runway 20 at night. So it's a very dark environment. If you're a VFR pilot that doesn't have a lot of experience flying at night, which I don't know if that was the case with this guy, so let me just be clear about that. In that type of environment, if you don't have a lot of experience, it can be very challenging to find the airport, unless you're flying an instrument approach, or unless you're very familiar with the area and have flown in and out of there at night. And even if you have flown in and out of there a lot at night, typically, in my opinion, I'm going to still go ahead and set up for an instrument approach and use that instrument approach to get myself aligned on final and use that to back everything up. So that way I can just cross-check myself, just because it's going to make it a lot safer. And I know you can fly a VFR at night, but in my opinion, like if you have an instrument rating, file IFR, fly an instrument approach, or fly it as a visual approach using the instrument approach to back you up, to make sure you're aligned with the correct runway, to make sure you're adhering to the appropriate altitudes as you're flying that approach. This is the approach to runway 20. This is the RNAV GPS approach. And I wanted to show you this because it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective on what's happening here. Because what we know is, he overflew the runway before he had the engine trouble. So we don't have the audio from his conversation with the approach controller prior to that approach, where he should have been handed off to the tower controller. And we don't know what he said to the tower controller or what happened there, but I am going to share some audio with you. And I have found a little bit more audio than what was previously reported in the news. But you can see here on this approach, and again, I think he was flying just a visual approach. That's my understanding. So this is just showing you kind of the altitudes where you would normally be at if you were flying this using an instrument approach to back you up. This final approach fix, it's just over 6 miles from the end of the runway. It's twitty. And if you're flying this approach correctly, you're going to intercept that fix right around 2,500 feet. And so he was at 2,900 feet at this point. So he was a little bit high, but that's still salvageable. You can still make that work. By the time he gets to 2 miles from the runway or so, where you would normally have your visual descent point, and let me see, Sticks, can we hide that comment there so we can see the screen? At that visual descent point, he should have been 1,120 feet, but he was at 2,300 feet. So what people have talked about, and I think this is what happened, and we can confirm that once we get the audio and get the final report from the NTSB. But I think what happened is, as he's flying that approach, he just doesn't see the airfield. He doesn't see the runway, and he's flying along. So at some point, he does talk to the tower controller, and I'm going to show you why. We know that here in a second. But obviously, when you're 2,300 feet and you're 2 miles from the end of the runway, you're not going to be able to make that happen. So he continues straight ahead. Talked about this. The radio calls with the tower controller aren't available. He stays at 2,300 feet. And the tower controller sent him back to talk to the approach controller, and his engine failed shortly thereafter. Before I share the audio with you, if you guys haven't seen it already, you can go over to Juan Brown's channel, Blanco Lirio. He did a pretty good analysis on this, where he kind of digs into a very likely or a very possible scenario that would have led to fuel starvation on one of the with the aircraft, just by not selecting the correct fuel tank in flight. So I'm not going to dig into that too much. If you want to find out more about that, you can find it on Juan's channel. Really like a lot of the stuff that he does. But here's the audio, and we'll talk about this here.
Bravo Whiskey Hotel, Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo Whiskey Hotel, approach you up. If you can glide in there, sir. If you can go approach.
Sorry, start at the beginning here. So the words in white are going to be from the pilot, and then the yellow is going to be from the controller. And this is the first audio call that I have from him.
Nashville approach. This is Canadian Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo Whiskey Hotel.
Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo Whiskey Hotel, Nashville.
I'm overflying the field, the John Tune Airport, the 2,500. Need to come back to land at runway 20. If you can guide me around, please.
Are you trying to go back to land at John Tune?
Roger.
Okay, no. Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo Whiskey Hotel, contact John Tune Tower 119 or 45.
I did. They sent me back to you.
Okay, stand by 1 second.
All right, during that 40 seconds, I've paused it here for a second. During that 40 seconds, that's the point. We don't have this matched up with the ADS-B data to show the exact timing, but my best guess is what's happening here is, he's talked to the tower at some point, obviously, because he says the tower sent me to talk to you, to the approach controller. And they're having this discussion back and forth about whether he needs to talk to approach or talk to the tower. And during that 40 seconds is that time for where he's passed over the runway and he's continuing out straight ahead. And this is before he has any engine trouble, but that's about to change real quick.
Charlie, Foxtrot, Bravo, Whiskey, Hotel. Do you still have Johnstown Airport in sight? Army 20723, contact 2592.
Nashville, I'm declaring an emergency. My engine shut down.
5 for Army Contour 20723.
Thank you. Southwest 1059, Friday 130 to center maintain 5000.
130 down to 5,000, Southwest 1059.
South 1059, visual approach point right.
All expected.
Okay, so just to back it up for a second, the reason why the controller doesn't respond to him and it sounds kind of garbled is when he keys that mic to tell him he's got the problem there. The controller most likely never heard him because there was the Southwest guy was making a radio call at the same time. So the controller only heard one of those transmissions coming in because they're stepping on each other.
Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo, Whiskey, Hotel. Are you trying to land at Johnstown?
My engine turned off. I'm at 1,600. I'm going to be landing. I don't know where.
Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo, Whiskey, Hotel. I'm declaring an emergency. Do you have the airport in sight? Straight in runway 2. Straight in runway 2 at Johnstown. Do you have the airport?
Yes, I have the runway in sight.
November 5 Alpha Tango, runway 2. Runway 2, clear to land.
I'm too far away. I won't make it.
Okay.
Keep flying that airplane.
Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo, Whiskey, Hotel. Charlie Foxtrot, Bravo, Whiskey, Hotel. Approach you up. If you can glide in there, sir. If you can glide in, they're clearing the runway for you.
So that's pretty tough to hear. That's one of the most dangerous attitudes that I think a pilot can have is, in addition to the other 4 that we've talked about, is that sense of resignation. And you could hear it in his voice, where he says, I'm going to land, but I don't know where. And I feel like at that point, he just kind of gave up on what was happening. So I don't know if it was just a long day or what, but this happens. I think a lot of times when pilots find themselves in a challenging situation, an emergency, and they get this sense of, well, I don't know what to do. What's the use? I can't do anything to fix this situation. And for somebody flying at night into an airfield that they're probably not familiar with, it's dark outside. You don't know where you're going. You've just lost your engine, and now you're at 1,600 feet. You're not going to make it back to the runway. And it's like this sense of like, well, I might as well just give up. There's nothing else I can do. And you hear somebody step on the radio and they say, keep flying that airplane. And that is the fix for the resignation attitude. You can't give up. And I know I've never thankfully found myself in a situation like that. But if you ever are, you have to keep flying the airplane no matter what. If you keep flying the airplane, if you land, if you end up landing in a field or end up hitting some trees or something like that, you have a better chance of surviving that than not flying the airplane or over controlling the airplane and getting yourself into a stall spin type of situation. And I don't want to analyze exactly what happened with him, but as he's making that turn back around, I don't know if he was trying to land on the interstate or not, but he ended up crashing just off to the side of the interstate, right behind the, I think it was a Costco right there. So the question, I think this is a good one, but couldn't he try and restart the engine? And this is going to be something that yes, you can try to restart an engine in certain situations, as Joel said. But I think Juan kind of talked about this in his video, where if it's one of these fuel issues, as long as you identify it in a fast enough manner where you know, hey, this is what caused the engine to quit, then you can do something with, I think it's the fuel boost pump, the electric fuel boost pump or something in that aircraft, but it's going to take about 10 seconds or so for that to register and then for it to, kick in and actually start working again. So I don't know if that's what happened, and that's why I tend to avoid trying to cover these mishaps when they're so fresh like this, because you just don't know and you don't want to speculate. But yes, you want to try to fix the situation, but you got to remember, so the one of the things I talk about in a lot of videos, or that pilots know, is aviate, navigate, and communicate. So the aviate part of that is you got to keep flying the aircraft. You don't want to stall that aircraft while you're trying to troubleshoot. And when you're losing an engine at low altitude at night in the dark, and you've got a wife and 3 kids, who are now panicking probably too, that is a lot to deal with. So that's just, it's very difficult. All right. I want to do one more thing here, and that is I wanted to share with you guys. I'm going to show this to you if I can pull it up here real quick, because this is over on Flystow. And the only reason I want to just bring this up again is because I do really think that this is a tool that a lot of people can use to help you out as a pilot. So this is the Charlie Foxtrot Bravo Whiskey Hotel flight. Thank you so much for the super chat. Wow, definitely appreciate that. Appreciate the support. This software, if you haven't tried it out and you're a pilot, please go test this out and you guys tell me what you think and give me some feedback. You've got different views here, so you can look at the cockpit view, and it's not going to show you the weather when you're in the cockpit view, but it will show you ground speed, and you've got altitude there, and you can look at it from all throughout the flight, and it does a pretty good recreation of what's going on here. When you go back to the 2D model and you go ahead and play it, one of the things that it's going to show you, if the weather data is available, is it's going to show you some of that weather. And as far as we know, weather was not a factor in this crash. There looks like some weather here on the descent as he's starting to fly the approach. But then you can have different overlays on here as well. Now, I will caution you that when it comes to ADS-B data, the accuracy of it sometimes, especially when you get to low altitude and you get into these dynamic stall spin, or especially in a stall or spin, as I've seen in some other mishaps that I've tried to pull the ADS-B data from, it doesn't necessarily show it as accurate as possible, because this is not pulled straight from the flight. It's not like downloading it from the aircraft. It's a ADS-B transmission here. So this is going to show he actually flies over here, and we know that's not what happened. He ended up crashing. I think this is the Costco over here. And he ended up crashing right around here on the interstate, right behind that Costco there. But it's a really cool tool. You've got your altitude, and down at the bottom, you can look at your speed and vertical speed, and you can see all that. So like I said, he overflew this runway, and I think it's this segment in here, where he's doing this, talking to the controller, and then trying to figure out what they're going to do, and then gets turned back around, in the process there, and then that sense of resignation. But at night, if I'm out here, I don't know where else I'm going to land, because if I'm not familiar with it, you've got a lot of terrain up here, a lot of hills, you've got a lot of trees, And really the only place you might be able to land is on that interstate, but trying to land on there at night when you've never done anything like that before and have very limited experience, in this type of scenario is just going to be very challenging, but you can't give up. Don't fall victim to that attitude of resignation. So, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the live stream. Thank you again to Styx for helping to moderate all this. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone in the comments for keeping it as clean as possible during this. So what I'd like to do is start doing these about every 2 weeks. And if you haven't already, I meant to share this and I can't believe I forgot this. On my website, this is where I'm getting some of these from. So if you go over to my website, let's see here. Share this with you guys. You can fill out a debrief request. When you fill out that debrief request form, that's going to go straight to me. I'm going to tell you, ever since I put this up, I've probably gotten about, I don't know, about 150, 200 debrief requests in the last 2 weeks. So I cannot guarantee that I will get back to you. In fact, I don't respond to most of them because it's just way too many on top of all the emails I get every day. But this is a very valuable tool because I use this to help influence the channel. So you guys have a role in all of this. And there were so many people that requested that the debrief on the Foxtrot Bravo Whiskey Hotel through this form. That's why I included it in today's mishap or in today's live stream. And the other events that I talked about, a couple of those were also submitted through the debrief request form. So if you have a debrief that you want me to take a look at, throw it in here. I may include it on a live stream in the future, or I may make an entire video out of it because there are some really good ones in there that I think are worth making videos. And I appreciate your support. And we will see you guys again in a couple weeks.